William Cowper was born in 1731, and he fought depression for pretty much all of his life. In fact, it was so bad that when he was 30, they committed him to what was then termed a lunatic asylum for mental issues, probably a mental hospital, but they didn't know what to do with people like that, so they didn't really call him a hospital. They just kind of set him aside and tried to care for him. While he was a patient there, he came to know Christ. He came to faith in Christ, and that evangelical faith would be the anchor of his soul for his entire life. I don't know how long he was in the asylum. He obviously got out. He soon began to make money by writing poetry. He had been recognized from the time he was very young as a very talented poet, and he actually began to sell poems and songs and make money for those. One of his best-selling poems, I remember because of the name, is called The Ballad of John Gilpin, interestingly enough. And it's a crazy poetic story about a runaway horse that belonged to one John Gilpin and his ride on that runaway horse. It's kind of a crazy story, but I could connect with that because of the name. He became best friends with John Newton. Now, if you don't know that name, but it's familiar, John Newton was the former slave trader, became a Christian, and most famous for writing the song Amazing Grace. And he and John Newton were good friends. They were in the same church. He was in the church that John Newton pastored. And together they wrote a number of popular hymns for the church. They released a book called the Olney Hymns, not only, but Olney, that's the name of the church, the community they were in, the Olney Church, and they released a book called the Olney Hymns, which has had a big impact on English hymnology. William Cowper continued to fight depression all his life. It was a struggle his whole life. Yet in spite of that, he penned some of the most amazing and famous early Christian hymns, including these words some of you will recognize. There is a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains. The dying thief rejoiced to see that fountain in his day, and there may I, though vile as he, wash all my sins away. Those are amazing words from a man suffering horrible depression, aren't they? You know, none of us are beyond times of depression in our lives. All of us are susceptible to times of depression in our lives. David, who wrote some of the greatest praise songs in history, was susceptible to depression. David, who was described as a man after God's own heart. David, who was called the sweet singer of Israel. David, who was the greatest king Israel ever had, was susceptible to depression. And today we're going to look at a passage where David went through one of the lowest points of his life. And in looking at that, I think it's instructive to us what he did to walk through that can help us when we face those low points in our life, those depressions that are in our own life. And so we want to look at that passage today. It's in 1 Samuel. We're going to look at chapters 29 and 30 together. If you've been with us, you know we've been in this study of 1 Samuel for a long time now. The beginning of the year is when we started this, so it's been a long one. But we have just a couple more weeks left to finish this series. But before we do, we have to go through a pretty low point in David's life. We looked at the life of Samuel in the first section of this book. We looked at the reign of King Saul in the next one. And then we've been looking at David and his life ever since. You might remember that David was anointed to be the next king of Israel. King Saul was rejected by God because he was disobedient to God, and Samuel the prophet anointed David to be the next king, and eventually Saul became aware of that, and Saul was very jealous of David. He was also jealous because of the famous story of David and Goliath the giant. And when David killed Goliath, the people sung his praises and made him the hero. Instead of the king who led the army, it was David who was the hero, and Saul was very jealous of that. And Saul began to pursue David to kill him. And a huge chunk of this book, if you remember, through the middle of this book, is all about Saul pursuing David to kill him. And when David finally got tired of hiding in the wilderness of Judah, he fled to the Philistines. That's kind of interesting because if you know the story or if you've been with us, those were the greatest enemies of Israel and David, were the Philistines. And yet David felt like he needed to get away, and so he fled to the Philistines, to Achish, the king of Gath, and that man made David an officer in his army. And so David is there with the Philistines, being called an officer in the Philistine army. He also, this king, gave David a little town called Ziklag, which continued to be a part of Israelite territory for a number of centuries after that. And it was there that David made his home while he was with the Philistines in this town called Ziklag. And from there, he and his army of 600 would go out and make raids against the various enemies of the nation of Israel and of the Philistines. And so that was happening. David was deceiving King Achish into thinking he was fighting Judah, because when you read where he never went to the towns of Judah. He went to the enemies of Judah, but he told Achish, he said, I'm attacking and raiding these towns, including the towns of Judah. So he led him to believe that he was doing that. There's really a debate among scholars in this section about, was David acting on his own? Did he never sought the Lord? Was he just taking matters into his own hands when he fled to the Philistines? Or was he seeing that as a way to deceive Achish and make him believe he was on his side, but actually using it to infiltrate their camps? Some of the answers that David gives to King Achish are so vague you could interpret them either way. And so scholars have this debate, and I'm not going to land on that, but you'll see how that debate kind of plays into this story as we go through it. Well, in chapter 28 that we were in a few weeks ago, it said that it began with, in those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war. They gathered their forces for war against Israel. And that's where we were a few weeks ago. I know it's been a while because we had a few weeks off of this series, but Saul saw the army gathering. Remember, the Philistines were the army with the great technology. They had iron. Israel didn't. They had chariots. Israel didn't. And so they were the technology leaders of the area, and Saul saw their army, and he was terribly afraid. And if you remember our message from a few weeks ago, he decided to pursue a medium, somebody who could supposedly talk to the dead, so he could call up Samuel and ask Samuel what he should do. And we talked about the problem with Saul doing that. And that was happening after the armies began to gather. That took a few days. Well, during those few days, David was having kind of some issues of his own that he had to deal with. And that's what these two chapters are about what David was dealing with while the armies were gathering, while Saul took a few days to go talk to the medium. This is what David was doing. Remember, he was with Achish. He was an officer in King Achish's army. So David was going to go to battle with the Philistines. That's what the king expected. He expected nothing less. If you go back to chapter 28, verse 1, it says, Achish said to David, understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army. You're going to go out with me, David. You're going to be in the battle. That put David in a really compromised position, because either he had to go fight against his own people, and remember, he'd been anointed to be their future king, or he had to go back on his promise to serve Achish and be in his army. He had to be unfaithful to that. And so it puts him in a really tight position. Some people believe he's in that tight position because he wasn't seeking God and God just let that happen. Some people believe he was in that position because it was an opportunity to defeat the Philistines, and that's how David viewed it. Again, it goes back to that earlier debate, and David's comments don't make it real clear where he is. But God preserved him from that difficult situation, because as the armies were coming together, the armies of the Philistines, the commanders of the Philistines didn't like what they saw. And they saw David and they complained about him. And this is where we pick up the story today in chapter 29. Beginning in verse 2. As the lords of the Philistines were passing by hundreds and by thousands, David and his men were passing on in the rear with King Achish. And the commanders of the Philistines said, "Who are these Hebrews? What are they doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "This is David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years, and since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day." But the commanders of the Philistines were angry, and the commanders of the Philistines said to Achish, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place where you've assigned him. He shall not go with us into the battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could he reconcile himself to his own Lord? Would it not be with the heads of our men?" And so they saw what Achish failed to see, that this would be an incredible opportunity for David to get back on Saul's good side and go back to where he had been anointed king. They saw that, Achish didn't see it. Now, some people ask the question, well, if he's a king, how come he just didn't overrule the commanders and say David is going? Well, the answer is the Philistines weren't ruled by a king. The Philistines were ruled by a council of kings. In fact, the 5 major cities of the Philistines each had their own king that ruled that city and the area around it, and those 5 came together as a council, and they were the rulers of the Philistines. And so, he had 1 vote out of 5, and it's interesting that it says the commanders of the army complained about David, but later it says it's the lords of the Philistines who didn't want David there. And so either it calls those kings the commanders, which is possible, or the commanders of the smaller thousands and hundreds of legions complained about David to their king, and those kings outvoted Achish. That's why you think as a king he could just say this is the way it is, but he couldn't do that because of that. It's interesting that he said, "David has deserted to me. There's no fault in him." But the others prevailed anyway. Verse 9 says, Achish answered David and said, "I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go into battle with us." So Achish sent David home. Now, David protested the idea. Whether it was a serious protest or he was just feigning a protest, again, it depends on why you believe David was there. But either way, a lot of the interpreters say David was really relieved at this point in time, because God used Achish and those other commanders to remove him from a very compromised position. And he didn't have to go out and fight against his own army. He didn't have to go back on his promise to Achish. And so God arranged the situation so that he didn't have to do that. There's one interesting note here, though, in the conversation between Achish and David in verse 6 of chapter 29. Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest to me, and it seems right that you should march out with me in this campaign." Now, did you notice something interesting? He swears to David by whom? By the Lord. It's capital letters. It's Yahweh, or as we sang today, Jehovah, as some people say. It's God's proper name. It's the one true God of the universe. And Achish swears to David by the name of that God. And it could be that David, in his conversations with Achish, has convinced him there's only one true God. But that would put David in even a bigger compromised position. The more likely thing is Achish was just appeasing David by calling on David's God on his name, is probably what's going on. But it's an interesting little note that a Philistine would say that. And so David headed home to Ziklag, the city that Achish had given him. And when he got there with his army, they discovered bad news. Bad news. Listen to chapter 30 now, the first couple of verses. Now, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but they carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. While they were gone, the city was raided by the Amalekites. And the women and children were taken. All of their wives were taken. Anything of value was probably taken, and the rest was burned. And so David and his army returned to utter destruction, is what they found when they got back to their home. And that brings us to the absolute low point of the whole story. I think the low point of the whole book. Verses 4 and 6, David and the people who were with him raised their voices. They wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's two wives had also been taken captive. And David was greatly distressed, verse 6, for the people spoke of stoning him because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his own sons and daughters. They wept until they had no more strength to weep. Isn't that a fascinating statement? David was greatly distressed, and his men blamed him as though he had something to do with the Amalekites coming in. He was left absolutely alone in this situation. It's, I said, the low point of the book. But David moved ahead. He inquired of God what to do through the priest that was there, and he asked God, should we go after this raiding party? And God said, yes, go after them. You'll catch them, and you will recover everything. And so based on that promise, David and his men set out after the raiding party. It had been a long couple of days. And because of that, 200 of his 400 men were simply too exhausted to go on. And so David took 400 of his men, and based on God's promise, they went ahead to pursue this Amalekite raiding party. God put a good detail in the way to help them. Because as they were there, you'll find a little later down in verse 11, they found an Egyptian slave. He was a slave of an Amalekite who was a part of the raid. And this slave had become sick, and they didn't want to deal with him, so they just left him to die. And apparently they found him soon enough, or he had somewhat recovered. And after David and his men gave him food and gave him water, and he'd recovered a little bit, they gave him a promise of safety, and he was able to take them to where the raiding party was. And party is a good word, because that's what they were doing when David and his men got there. They found the raiding party, and they were having a drunken party. Verse 16 in chapter 30 says, when he, that is the slave, had taken David down, behold, they were spread abroad over the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. They said, hey, we got all this spoil. We had absolutely no opposition because all the armies were gone. That's something to celebrate. So they traveled a short ways away from where they were, and they began to celebrate in a huge drunken stupor. And that's how David and his men found them. After 2 days of that, as you can imagine, they were in absolutely no shape to defend themselves. And David and his small army, in spite of the size of this one, were able to go in and defeat this army, and they recovered all of their spoil. They recovered all of their wives and children. And they also got a whole bunch more spoil because, oops, sorry, that wasn't my brain, that was my feet. And they got a whole bunch more spoil because the Amalekites had been raiding a whole bunch of other places, plus they had their own supplies with them. And so they got all of this spoil from there. And so the raiders were defeated, and that's always good in Denver, right? So... the rest of the chapter says what they do with the spoil, and we're not going to spend a lot of time there because it doesn't impact what we're really looking at today. But I just do want to point out one thing, and that is the army called it David's spoil, but David didn't do that. David called it the Lord's spoil. Down in verse 23, he makes it clear that this came from the Lord, it belongs to him, and we should use it to bless other people, not just for ourselves. And so the fact that it was David's spoil or Lord's spoil determined what David was going to do with it. And it's just a good reminder for us not to hold things we have that God gives us too tightly, because as God gives us blessings, we need to bless others with those. But that's not the big idea today. I think the big idea, the major thing we need to learn is this. Again, David was at an absolute low point, maybe the lowest point of his life. There's another one later when his son rebels, but possibly the lowest point of David's life. It's the lowest point in the book of 1 Samuel. He had been rejected by Saul, his king. He had been pursued by Saul to be killed. And as you remember, time and time again, Saul was pursuing him. He was away from his own home country. He was away from his family. The promise of him being king seemed further away now than it had ever been before. He was in a foreign country, and now he's rejected there as well. His wives, possibly children, we don't think he had any at this point, but if he did, his children, but also the children of his men, were all gone. Those wives may have been some of the only stability in his life in his flight from Saul. They were gone. His city and all his possessions were either gone or burned. And his faithful army, the other stability in his life, was against him. It doesn't get much lower than that, does it? It doesn't get much lower than that. There was another low point in this story that we looked at about 6 weeks ago. It was in the midst of all of those pursuits of Saul. We talked about, I said we're going to do 11 sermons in one because there were 11 different stories of Saul pursuing David in various places, if you remember that sermon. And near the end of all of that pursuit, there's this fascinating verse. Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. Saul's son Jonathan, David's best friend, came to him to strengthen him at that point in time. But you know what? There's no Jonathan now. David's in Jonathan's in enemy territory. There's no Jonathan to encourage him. And so that makes him feel even lower, makes the situation even worse. So what did David do? Well, if you're reading along, I skipped a phrase, and you probably noticed. The end of verse 6. At this lowest point, it said, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. That's the key phrase of the whole passage. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. You know, in this same story, Saul was desperate. But what did Saul do? He went the wrong way. He looked in the wrong path. He relied on his own resources. But what did David do? David, who was also desperate, looked to God for strength. That's where he looked to find his strength. When our situation seems dark or hopeless, when nothing's going our way, as David felt, we have to do what David did. We have to find our strength in God. That's easy to say, isn't it? But what does it mean in practical terms? Well, I think David tells us, even though this passage doesn't tell us, because David expresses some of these low points in the Psalms that he wrote. And we've looked at a few of those as we've gone through this series, but there's one particular psalm that said, Psalm 63, if you look at it, there's a little subtitle to it, and it says in that subtitle, a psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. This song was written when David was probably fleeing from Saul, when he was out in the wilderness at one of these really low times, and he gives his recipe for how he gets strength from God, how he finds strength in the Lord, his God. And so turn to Psalm 63, and I think I put it in the app if you're using the digital notes. It should be in there as well. Psalm 63. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and your glory. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. He gives us a 5-step recipe to find our strength in God in those few verses. Here's what they are. Number 1, he seeks God earnestly, to the point of having it like a thirst. God, I earnestly seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. He is seeking God with everything he has because he wants to find God. And related to that, he cries out to God. That's step number 2. The very first thing, God, you are my God. And so he cries out to God in the midst of that low point. Eric Metaxas and Stan Guthrie wrote an article for Breakpoint a couple years ago about depression. This is what they said. If you're dealing with depression, you might as well know there are no quick fixes, but there is always the grace of God. Depression should throw us into God's arms. So let me ask you, has it thrown you into God's arms? Let's stop all the facades. Depression is an unwelcome fact of life for many of us. But being depressed doesn't mean your faith in the Lord is defective. It is an invitation to present your pain as an offering to the one who understands that pain better than anyone else. There's no quick fixes, but there's always the grace of God. They quote in that article a 1998 Duke University study that was kind of interesting. It revealed that for adults over 65, it didn't say anything about younger ages, but for us that are that age, adults over 65 who attend church weekly and read the Bible regularly have lower blood pressure and less depression than others. Isn't that interesting? Duke University study, not necessarily biased one, a well-known university that said if you go to church weekly and read your Bible regularly, you have less depression and lower blood pressure than everybody else. Wow, that's pretty profound. And that's what David was doing. He was seeking God. He was crying out to him. Number 3 is in verse 2, meditate on God's power and glory. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and your glory. Remember, I started this message with a guy named William Cowper. Apparently, he had that figured out because he wrote these famous words as well. God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. He recognizes and praises the God who is sovereign, his power and his might. Another thing to meditate on is God's steadfast love. Look at verse 3. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. William Cowper hinted at that in that song, God Moves in Mysterious Ways, when he talked about the clouds of mercy. Marshall Siegel, writing for Desiring God, said of depression, while many are lost to their depression, helplessly wandering in their own darkness, Christians have somewhere to turn. They have truths to rehearse, or we have truths to rehearse until our hearts catch up with the faith in our minds. Not only did Christ save and deliver the brokenhearted, but he experiences all the pains, all the temptations that we face and more. So if you're depressed, please, please, please remember, you are not alone. You can always look to the grace and mercy and steadfast love of God. William Cowper understood it. Dear dying Lamb, thy precious blood shall never lose its power till all the ransomed church of God be saved to sin no more. Ere since by faith I saw that stream, thy flowing wounds supply, redeeming love has been my theme, and will be, shall I die. Shall be till I die. Get the words right. So you meditate on God's power and glory. You meditate on his steadfast love. And then on those meditations, you simply spend time in prayer, in praise. Time in praise. Verse 4. So I will bless you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. William Cowper ended that famous hymn, There is a Fountain, with these words. When this poor lisping, stammering tongue lies silent in the grave, then in a nobler, sweeter song, I'll sing your power to save. Here's a guy that suffered depression all his life, and he got it. We call on God, we meditate on his power and glory, we meditate on his steadfast love, and we turn and we praise him in that. There's no quick solution to depression, but there's always, always the grace of God.